Alcibiades turned his charismatic touch once again to Athens, the same country from which he had been expelled 4 years before. In 411 BC, a handful of still loyal supporters appointed him once again as Athens' supreme military commander.
Aristophanes in the Frogs has a line that I translate this way about Alcibiades. They love him, they hate him, they cannot do without him.
And in the beginning of his now second time in power, Alcibiades seemed to be leading Athens to victory. Although Sparta now had a superior fleet, Athens tenaciously held on to its empire.
They just beat the Spartans time after time after time.
In fact, the Spartans didn't win a battle until Notium in 407 BC, when Sparta, under the leadership of Admiral Lysander, destroyed a great number of Athenian ships. But the real significance of the Battle of Notium is that it destroyed something more precious: Alcibiades' alliance with Athens.
Alcibiades is in command of the fleet at Notium, and for reasons that we simply don't know. He leaves the fleet in the hands not of another elected general, but of his own personal ship's steersman. That steersman gets tricked into giving battle to Lysander against Alcibiades' specific orders. The Athenians are defeated and almost finished off. So after that, Alcibiades can never come back to Athens again.
In 405 BC, Sparta was poised to decimate what remained of the once great Athenian navy. Lysander planned a final assault on the Athenian forces at Aigos Potamoi. In exile, Alcibiades learned of Lysander's plan and went to the front lines to warn his former Athenian friends.
When he was deposed, the Athenians went into the toilet, and then finally at the last gasp, he came back with the advice that would have saved them, which they ignored.
They refused to listen to him. We don't, after all, Alcibiades, you're not a terribly trustworthy character, which he was not. He was right in this case, however. The Athenians lose.
Alcibiades' luck had finally run out. The Athenian loss sent him into hiding, and in the process he was robbed of most of his money.
Alcibiades goes on to die rather ignominiously, probably as part of another love affair gone wrong, and is killed by irritable relatives of the girl.
He took enormous pleasure in his capacity to outwit people. And he outwitted himself in the end. But along the way, the path that he followed is simply extraordinary. I mean, there really is no other figure in Greek history who is quite as colorful and as interesting. And of course, in the end, it's fatal to him.
After their defeat at Aigos Potamoi, the people of Athens hid behind the walled city of Piraeus, and Lysander built a navy blockade across the entrance to the city's harbor.
The Athenians have lost their last fleet. They have lost the capacity to resupply the city. It's really only a matter of how many months can they hold out before they starve.
Athens fell in March of 404 BC. Lysander entered the city and took control of its government and its people. The 27-year Peloponnesian War was over.
People in Athens were petrified that the same thing that they had done to other cities during the course of the war, killing all the men, enslaving all the women and children, was about to be done to them.
There certainly was pressure from Thebes and Corinth, Sparta's most powerful allies, to burn Athens to the ground and enslave its population. But Sparta ultimately chose a different fate for Athens.
What was most significant about the way the Peloponnesian War ended is not that the Spartans, rather than the Athenians, won. It's that the Spartans chose not to destroy Athens. There were certainly people in Sparta who wanted to, and there were many Athenians who expected that this would happen.
Sparing Athens, however, was not done out of mercy, but out of political necessity.
The allies of Sparta really wanted the Athenians dead. But Lysander and the Spartans realized that by destroying Athens, they would create a power vacuum that would be filled by Thebes, with which the Spartans were already having trouble.
For Sparta, the question would be, if we don't destroy Athens, what will we do with it? The beginning of a new era in foreign policy will actually be the beginning of the end for Sparta. It was 404 BC. The 27-year-long Peloponnesian War was over, and so was the golden age of Athens.
The results of the Peloponnesian War is that an entire generation has learned nothing other than war. There's a whole generation who have not been able to invest their creative talent in architecture, literature, town planning. And so we see the great buildings on the Acropolis that are not finished. We see the gradual demise of great tragedy, and the great historians will be gone.
The Athenians also saw that Sparta was in control of their once great empire.
They take away the navy. They insist on breaking down places in the wall so that they're not defensible. There's no empire, there's no money, there's no fleet. They must become members of the Spartan alliance. They swear to have the same friends and enemies as the Spartans and follow them where they lead.
A new government was installed in Athens to essentially remake the democratic city-state into a mini Sparta.
Sparta made it its business to replace democracy everywhere it could with oligarchy. The Spartans thought that democratic regimes were too warlike, inspired too much popular enthusiasm, too disorderly, and too exposed to foreign ideas.
The terms of the peace that Sparta imposed upon Athens were that they should establish an oligarchic government, overseen by 30 pro-Spartan Athenians, and it came to be known as the 30 Tyrants.
The takeover of Athens was Sparta's first attempt at nation-building, and it was a dismal failure. Under the direction of Lysander, who was a far better admiral than diplomat, the so-called 30 Tyrants began a terror campaign against anti-Spartan forces inside Athens.
And they do terrible things. I mean, this is the worst internal civil war that Athens ever has. They kill something like 1,500 Athenians. It's an amazing number when you realize that the number of Athenian male adult members of the citizen class at that time might be around 25,000 people.
It was so bloodthirsty that the Athenian democratic exiles who marched back into Athens to retake their city had the support of the king of Sparta.
King Pausanias, who is now one of the kings in Sparta, is a traditionalist, very opposed to Lysander, very opposed to everything that's going on. And it's not too much to say that there is a conflict between kings.
Within several months, the victory over Athens had irrevocably divided Sparta, forced the rest of the Greek world to pick sides, and led to the mass murder of everyone in the middle.
The Peloponnesian War has taught people that you either have to look toward oligarchs or democrats for your safety, but men of moderation and men who try to bridge those political and economic differences wind up dead.
It was, in every sense of the word, a Pyrrhic victory, a war in which no one wins.
Athens lost the war, and it lost its empire. Never would they be as powerful again as they had been before the Peloponnesian War. The funny thing, though, is that although Sparta won the war, it too was devastated. It's very ironic that at the very moment of their victory, the Spartans are really laying the groundwork for their own collapse.
After the installation of an oligarchy in Athens, Lysander supported the takeover of as many other city-states as possible in the former Athenian Empire. Sparta quickly sets up 10 oligarchs in each of the Athenian allied states. Instead of being liberated, the people were indoctrinated into a system that had them wondering if they had been too hasty in rejecting Athenian rule.
You want to trade the Acropolis And Athenian democracy for Spartan barley bread and the agoge, no one wants to do that. You want to trade an Athenian drachma for a piece of Spartan lead. Nobody wants to do that.
And unlike the Athenians, they weren't great orators. They weren't able to project an ideal that the other Greeks could rally around.
The new Spartan leadership needed charisma to win over their new conquests, a quality sorely lacking in Spartan culture.
The fundamental weakness of that culture is the Spartans lack imagination. That's not prized at Sparta. They lack boldness, and they are not charming. They treat the other Greeks like dogs. And they do so because they think of themselves as being a breed apart, of being something absolutely superior to others.
There's a whole series of Spartan generals and leaders who go overseas, and they're brutal to the very people they're in charge of winning over. And what the Greek world has done is substitute an enlightened imperial master for sort of a brutal thuggery of inept Spartan commanders.
The type of discipline that they could impose on their own troops, that was one thing. But when they started imposing it on other people, they would make sailors would have to stand with iron anchors on their shoulders all day. That kind of thing didn't go over too big. People, they weren't too popular.
And here I think we have to go back to thinking about the training of a young Spartan. After all, who outside of your unit really matters? The world is a place to be exploited for the good of people who matter, and that's exactly the way they treat the Aegean. They act simply rapaciously in a way that pretty quickly has them involved fighting some of their own allies.
A brutal, imperialistic Sparta hell-bent on taking over the Greek world was not the reason why Sparta's allies fought for 27 years in the Peloponnesian War.
Sparta is ready to step in as the next great imperial power. This is shocking to Sparta's allies. The allies of Sparta had supposed that Sparta was going to be a liberator, was going to create a free Aegean, free of the imperial state, Athens. The Spartans don't see it that way. They see basically the opportunity to take just what they want.
The first city-state to successfully rebel against Spartan hegemony was the first that fell, Athens. In 403 BC, the Athenians returned to Piraeus and led a successful revolt against the 30 tyrants of Lysander.
Aristotle wrote that there is little point in creating a culture based solely on martial valor, because there is this thing, peace, with which one has periodically to deal. The Spartans didn't understand this. They could be counted on, once they had won the war, to lose the peace. A year didn't go by in the 4th century when the Spartans didn't manage to alienate someone who had once been their ally. They had an uncanny gift for this.
Sparta's fatal mistake in the years following the Peloponnesian War was underestimating the importance of keeping their allies happy.
No city-state in Greece, no matter how great its military prowess, could run the Greek world without the help of other allied states. They also had to worry about managing the 800-pound gorilla in their corner, Persia. Sparta had to figure out some way to keep these states as its friend. Instead, what Sparta does is alienate every last one of them. And that is a recipe for disaster.
In short order, Sparta managed to ignite the hatred of its two largest, and up until this point, loyal allies, Thebes and Corinth.
There is a breach very quickly between them and some of their allies who are too powerful just to ignore them.
Within a decade of their great victory, Sparta is again at war, and this time the invincible Spartan war machine will be broken beyond repair. Around 398 BC, the winds of change blasted into the Spartan capital. King Agis, who had supported and defended the new imperialistic vision of Sparta, died. His brother, Agesilaus, took over the Spartan throne.
King Agesilaus, who is an out-and-out imperialist who wants to dominate Greece proper, who wants to impose governments made up of his friends wherever he can, so alienates the Greeks, and most powerfully the Thebans, as practically to awaken a new Thebes in its hatred for Sparta.
Thebes had been a long-standing and steadfast Spartan ally. Located in the region known as Boeotia, Thebes was a geographically strategic ally during the Peloponnesian War, and Sparta used Thebes to conquer Athens. But unbeknownst to Sparta, Thebes used the war to become steadily stronger and wealthier.
Any wealth that is found in the countryside is carted off by the Thebans. Furthermore, in the course of the war, the Thebans begin to feel their oats as a military power, and they are able to unite Boeotia.
The Thebans also used the waning days of the war to create a new, stronger kind of government.
While all the Peloponnesian War has been going on, there's been a miraculous revolution in Thebes, where a very conservative rural yeomanry has suddenly created a democratic society which has involved all of their population.
The thought of a democratic Thebes so close to Athens was a terrifying prospect for the Spartans. When they caught wind of what was brewing among their allies' citizenry, Sparta did what was apparently their one and only form of foreign policy.
The Spartans, rather than mollifying the Thebans and sharing power with the Thebans, go for the jugular and attempt to turn Thebes into a Spartan client, to squelch Theban democracy and to destroy Theban independence.
Sparta has these very brutal attacks on Thebes and tries to overthrow the government. There creates a backlash, and that backlash doesn't stop with anti-Spartanism. It creates a democratic groundswell, and there is created a national Theban army of 10,000 hoplites who are in physical ability, training, and strategic thinking every bit as effective as a Spartan army, and they're angry at Sparta.
The Theban army was under the command of Epaminondas, a man who was greater than anyone before him, and who would have the single greatest impact on the future of Sparta.
He was a great general who contrived tactics that had never been used before.
In the beginning, King Agesilaus of Sparta was undaunted, and he was able to keep an oligarchy in place. But with every battle that Agesilaus won, Sparta was losing something very important.
In the long run, what he ends is stripping Spartan resources, losing a substantial number of Spartan men in battle, and helping to train the Thebans in the new order of battle that would emerge in this new age. He shows some real talent. He is militarily extremely astute. He shows some real political talent. But Agesilaus doesn't seem to pay attention to the really basic notion of Spartan statecraft, and that is, don't fight the same enemy too often. Don't let them learn your tricks.
Epaminondas not only learned Sparta's tricks, he figured out how to fight back and win.
They engaged the Thebans far too many times, and they had the misfortune of dealing this time with a rising military power that was every bit as tough, but was now adopting new and very effective military tactics.
Epaminondas had another powerful weapon at his disposal: Athens. Since the ousting of the 30 tyrants in 403 BC, the Athenians had slowly but surely rebuilt their fleet, trained a new generation of citizen soldiers, and developed a stronger democracy.
It's profoundly ironic that its defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War was one of the best things that happened to Athens, if you look at it from the standpoint of democracy. Because after the bloody oligarchy that the Spartans had established, democracy in Athens was there to stay.
Athens was an important ally of Thebes throughout the first bloody decade of the 4th century BC. Thebes also built strong alliances with Argos and Corinth to form a united front against Sparta.
Now, this is the really key one, Corinth, because Corinth was the key member, the single key member of the Peloponnesian League. For it to defect and go over to the Athenian, Boeotian, Theban and Argive axis was a really severe statement and a really severe blow.
In 379 BC, an uprising successfully removed the Spartan oligarchy from Thebes.
When the Thebans were able to overthrow this regime in 379, the new regime was dedicated more than anything else to get Sparta. And there were so many other states who now hated the Spartans for other reasons that they were able to get assistance in the doing of it.
The list of Spartan defectors grew. If a city-state didn't hate Sparta for being imperialistic, or hegemonic, or brutal, they hated them for a new reason. There was a growing sense among Sparta's few remaining allies that Spartiates won wars because they were willing to sacrifice allied troops, but not themselves.
When they had coalition warfare, they were pretty clearly going to fight on the right wing, no matter what. Now, that meant that the enemy, who also put their crack troops on their right wing, would not be facing the Spartans. And so in a series of battles, the Spartans were usually fighting the inferior troops of the enemy. And often we see this strange series of events where allies that fight among each other have more tension than the enemy across the battlefield. So if you want to get rid of some of your suspicious allies, you put them on the left wing, and the Spartans were notorious for doing that.
It was profoundly ironic that the city-state that was the most insular, the most anti-imperialistic, and the most unwilling to fight unless absolutely necessary, was now fighting all over the known world to maintain its control. It all came to a head at Leuctra, in the region of Boeotia.
Partly because they have been oppressed by the Spartans, partly because they have worked with the Spartans and learned from them, and partly because they have a remarkable generation of leaders. Talk about your greatest generation. The Thebans finally pull off the inconceivable. They defeat a Spartan army in a hoplite battle.
In 371 BC, the Spartans returned to a newly democratic Thebes for one more attempt at a takeover. They were met on a plain near Leuctra by Epaminondas, his elite 300 warriors of the Sacred Band, and a massive allied troop force. Thebes also had radically new tactics that would challenge the Spartan phalanx.
First thing Epaminondas did was he put his best troops on the left, and that had a number of ramifications. It meant that the battle would be a head-to-head among the elite contingents. Epaminondas would not be killing Peloponnesian allies. He would be killing Spartans. He would be telling his own allies, you're not going to have to face the Spartans, we're going to face the Spartans.
The Spartan army was not only defeated, it was destroyed. More than 70% of its troops that fought in the battle were dead.
Two main reasons why Sparta loses the key battle of Leuctra. One is its inflexibility, the fact that it's unwilling to or unable to respond to innovations, for example, deepening the line, new special forces, new equipment, and so on. But the other is simply numbers.
The Spartans don't have enough men anymore. They simply don't have the 9,000 men that they had been able to fight with in the Persian Wars. They don't have the 5,000 men that they fought with in the Peloponnesian Wars. They're down to a handful of full Spartans. The ones that are left fight well, there are just not enough of them.
Epaminondas simply bowled the Spartans over. They killed 700 of them, which they could ill afford to lose, and they discredited the entire idea of Spartan military invincibility. And then most importantly, Epaminondas did not see that as the end of things, but as the beginning.
After its defeat at Leuctra, a battered and demoralized Spartan army retreated to its homeland to regroup.
It's a devastating defeat for the Spartans, but it needn't have been a death blow, and it wouldn't have been a death blow if the Spartan system had the reserves, if it had the flexibility, the resources to respond to defeat. It's an indictment of the Spartans that this is precisely what they don't have.
Sparta's greatest asset, their social and political structure, was now their greatest liability. What had been once the source of their power and stability was now the source of their weakness and inertia. In 362 BC, the Spartans were defeated again by the Thebans at the Second Battle of Mantinea.
The Spartans were so wrapped up in their old-fashioned ways that they failed to learn from experience again and again, the most astonishing instance of which is their failure to win at Mantinea when they were confronted with exactly the same tactics that had defeated them at Leuctra.
You stick your neck out. If somebody hits you, you don't do it again. You do something else. You learn from it. But Sparta did not go for innovations. It was in its character to be conservative and to retain what was there.
Not only had Sparta lost its edge in traditional hoplite battle, it was incapable of the kind of flexibility needed to meet the challenge of new forms of battle.
Warfare has evolved into naval warfare, to siege warfare, and all those require different skills than just valor or strength. They require knowledge, they require science. Once a city-state says we're going to poison your water, or we're going to fight you at night, or we're going to use slingers or archers or javelin throwers, then the Spartan system starts to collapse.
Warfare evolved, but Sparta did not. They continued the brutal practice of exposing unwanted infants and forcing young males to the trials of the agoge.
Perhaps they're being too rigorous in weeding out genetically inferior persons. By 370, we're down to as few as 1,000 adult males.
Ironically, the Spartan ideal of valor contributed to the decline. Developing a system where cowardice was a sin had left the best fighters not in Spartan regiments, but in Spartan graveyards.
Definition of cowardice would not necessarily be the one that we would use. It would not necessarily mean running away. Sometimes it meant surviving in a battle where everybody else was killed. The assumption was if you were any good, you would have been killed too.
The population decline was also the result of a Spartan birth rate that had been rapidly falling for at least a half-century.
Surely those nocturnal escape visits visited by punishment if one were discovered couldn't have been all that frequent, must have discouraged the opportunities for producing children, and must have contributed to the infamous decline of Spartan population over time.
If you want to have a vibrant population and you want to have women having children at 15, 16, 17, 18, which is necessary in the ancient world, given the prevalence of childhood diseases and the low survival rate of young kids, then it's a prescription for disaster.
Although there was a desperate shortfall of elite warriors, the Spartan system was conspiring to decrease their ranks even further.
Downward mobility was so easy, and upward mobility was virtually impossible. You could be demoted from the ranks for having failed to provide dinner for your messmates, for trembling in battle, from any number of other social sins, and there's really no way to come back up.
And so the Spartans developed a very dangerous sort of floating population of people who were Spartiates by birth, Spartiates by training, but had been deprived of Spartan citizenship. And so they were dishonored in a society in which honor was everything, and they would mean trouble.
That Sparta could allow this to happen, that it wasn't willing to make the ideological shift, and quite frankly, to commit the wealth to recruiting new members of the elite, is a terrible indictment of Sparta. And it bespeaks a state that was perhaps not fully in touch with reality.
And so now, for the first time in its long history, a weakened Sparta will be invaded and forced to defend itself on its own soil. Now, at its weakest point, Sparta had to face its biggest challenge. Epaminondas, the visionary Theban general, had a new vision: to redraw the map of the Peloponnese and cut off Spartan power at its source.
He was interested not just in destroying Spartan physical power, but destroying the myth of Spartan superiority, because that's really what was necessary to put the nail into the coffin. He understood that Sparta could not exist in anything like its traditional form if the Helots were freed.
They had depended completely on the agricultural labor of those Helots to keep the whole system going. Without Messenia, Sparta simply did not have the kind of resources to make it a first-class power.
With the backing of a Thebes, Athens, Corinth, Argos alliance, Epaminondas began phase one of his plan to destroy Sparta.
In early 369, he arrives in Messenia and announces that Messenians are no longer Helots, but will revert to their ancestral status as free and independent Greeks.
It's a very remarkable phenomenon, rather as if in the Old South one day you have black slaves and the next day they are citizens of their own state.
Epaminondas and his forces remained in Messenia nearly 4 months, while the liberated Helots, perhaps 250,000 strong, built a massive wall around the new city-state of Messene.
As these Messenians, of course, were the descendants of those many generations of Helots who had made Sparta what it was at the cost of their own independence and life, they were now in the happy position of presiding over the death of the great Spartan polis.
The one thing the Spartans have been trying for centuries to prevent, the return of Messenian independence, is precisely what happens.
And while the Helots built the walls of Messene, Epaminondas instituted phase 2 of his battle plan. Allied forces fortified a strategically key city to the north in Arcadia. It was called Megalopolis, literally in Greek, the great city.
Here was another strong, powerful city, fortified in the hands of people who had every reason to fear a resurgence of Sparta.
They hem the Spartans in, and they ensure that never again can Sparta have the power that it once had. From that moment on, Sparta becomes a dinosaur.
Epaminondas was now poised for invasion. He had the Spartans cornered, and he had 70,000 troops at his disposal.
He was an absolutely brilliant man because through sheer moral authority he created an army of retribution. First foreign army to be in the valley of Laconia in 600 years.
The famous saying that in the 600 years no Spartan woman had ever seen the smoke of the enemy's fire, that ended.
In response, Sparta did what it had never done before. It retreated and resigned itself to becoming a second-rate power in the Greek world.
The tide of history was against Sparta, the demography was against Sparta, the geography was against Sparta, and then its luck ran out when it met a man like Epaminondas.
After the liberation of Messenia in 370 BC, Sparta would never again rise to the level of power it had once enjoyed in the Greek world.
They fell from their own success. They had lived in a sort of a hothouse, hermetically sealed environment of self-reinforcing virtue, and they were not inoculated against the corruption and the temptations that they came into with success.
While other city-states now claimed the spotlight, Sparta was a shadow of its former self and became a kind of living museum. In fact, during Roman times, it was a kind of Spartan theme park, where leaders like Hadrian might have come to observe the locals and admire their now quaint ways.
The great historian Thucydides said that when future generations would look upon Athens, they would think that Athens was 10 times greater than it actually was, and that Sparta was 10 times smaller than it actually was. The Spartans had very little to parade before the world or to bequeath to posterity, because their houses were simple, their temples were simple. Once the power of Sparta dwindled, there would be very little left for people to look at. Whereas in Athens, it did not simply survive, it is there for the entire world to admire.
But the Spartans did leave behind their legacy. And even before the smoke had cleared, Athenian thinkers resurrected the nobler aspects of Spartan society in their own city-states.
They pioneer constitutional government and checks and balances. They set a precedent that the other Greeks follow.
Many Greek cities had very nasty civil wars. Spartans not. What was the secret? The ancients couldn't decide amongst themselves, as indeed we can't. Was it a democracy? Was it an oligarchy? Was it a bit of each? Was it, yeah. But something about it enabled it to persist over a very long period of time, and therefore to inspire a tradition of political theory which was very concerned with stability.
They were really thought of as a kind of an ideal of Greek civilization, of virtue, so that Socrates, Xenophon, Plato, the Republic was sort of based to a large extent on the actual polity of the Spartans. They were thought of as the way it should be.
And during the next 20 centuries, philosophers and politicians would return again and again to the glory that was once Sparta.
Sparta was idealized during the Italian Renaissance, and its oligarchic government, because of its alleged stability, was frequently put forward as a model for Venice. During the 18th century, in France in particular, people were positively in love with Sparta. Rousseau proclaimed that it was a republic of demigods, not men. During the French Revolution, many people wanted to die nobly, like Spartans.
During the American Revolution, Sparta was an inspiration to those seeking to create a stable, democratic country.
Thomas Jefferson said that he learned more from reading the history of Thucydides than from reading the local newspapers. Now, Thucydides tells the tale of how this radical democracy, Athens, lost the Peloponnesian War, and I think that's why Jefferson and the other framers of our Constitution took really Sparta more than Athens.
Our founding fathers pointed to Athenian democracy repeatedly as a horrible example of what we must not have here, which is to say true, direct democracy, unmediated by an aristocratic element that's supposed to check. And Sparta was good because everybody was public spirited and everybody was a citizen first.
When we go to Athens today and we look at the Parthenon and we think, cradle of democracy, it was the cradle of their democracy, but not ours.
In the 20th century, however, Sparta was embraced not by emerging democracies, but by individual leaders attracted to the more nefarious aspects of Spartan society.
Nazi Germany looked to Sparta for an ideal because the teaching of Sparta was introduced into the national curriculum.
Hitler and many of his friends spoke warmly about Sparta. Hitler expressed the wish that other countries might become helots for the German warrior caste.
In a way that's very similar to both Russia and Nazi Germany. The idea that if you coerce and regiment people into particular groups and you have a strong central government that controls everybody's lives, you will have a strong military for a while. But ultimately the contradictions of Soviet society or German society or Spartan society are manifest. And so I think it's legitimate to see the origins of totalitarianism in the Spartan society.
The lessons to be learned from Sparta continue to influence society even today.
The Spartans were the creators and the founders of what we can call Western military discipline. And that's going to be an enormous Western advantage through Greece, through Rome, through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, until we see today. Western armies simply have a different idea of what constitutes discipline. You take a Western army and you pit it against an Iraqi army, an Iranian army, an indigenous tribal army, and it will usually win. And it will usually win when it's outnumbered. And so we owe that legacy of Western discipline to the Spartans.
We can learn from them that honor should be an important component of human life. A person can live without honor because material means make it possible, but a person cannot die without honor, because when we die, there is somehow an account of our lives.
But Sparta's greatness is tempered by the fact that many people paid a terrible price for Sparta's achievements.
They had to subdue all sorts of human qualities which are necessary for a decent and properly functioning human being. It provided them with excuses for degrees of cruelty and selfishness and narrowness. The degree to which they accomplished superiority and honor at the cost of freedom, even their own freedom, is a caricature of what human flourishing requires.
It can be said that in the end, Sparta got what it deserved. Modern societies have an advantage. They have the hindsight of history to take the best that Sparta had to offer and discard the rest.